If you want to open your Bibles, we're going to look in the Gospel of Mark tonight for a little bit. And I want to read the story, or I want to study when Jesus feeds the 5,000. Trust me. Okay? Mark chapter 6, verse 45. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to Bethsaida. While he dismissed the crowd, after leaving them, he went up onto a mountainside to pray. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake. He was alone on land. And he saw his disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Now, the fourth watch of the night, he went out to them walking on the lake. And he was about to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost, and they cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. And immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." And then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. Now I know what you're thinking. You read the wrong thing. Because I said we're going to talk about the 5 loaves and the fish, right? This means yes, and girly at least, all right? Jesus has been with this crowd of people, and often as Jesus does, he tries to separate himself from a crowd either to pray, to meditate, or to teach his disciples. There's an undercurrent in the Gospels that Jesus is preparing his disciples for how they should behave after he's gone. And if you'll read the Gospels and look for what are the teachable moments where Jesus is talking about service, where Jesus is talking to them about greatness, where Jesus is talking to them about being the last shall be first and the first shall be last. This may be one of those situations because he's got this big multitude of people. John are experienced fishermen. They've gotten in the boat at evening. They're trying to cross. The most they could be doing is 6 miles. The least is probably less than a mile. They're trying to cross this body of water, and they can't do it. The wind is contrary. They've got a little storm blown up, and these guys are straining against the oars. It's hard to navigate in a storm. I don't know if you've ever been in rough water in a boat. I've been in 2 boat accidents. I'm not a strong swimmer. I'm 5'4". My definition of deep water is different than everybody else's. And I've had a boat completely leave us and go into the trees. And I had a boat completely leave us and go out from underneath us. And I spent about an hour and a half on an igloo cooler in the Tennessee River. Incidentally, the guy that pulled us out of the river recognized my voice in the dark, which was crazy. But I've been in the water at night in a storm, and it's not fun. In fact, it's scary. And these guys are in this boat. They're in the 4th watch of the night. Now, we assume that Mark writes his gospel with a Roman audience in mind. He'll define a lot of terms just like John does. And so when he talks about the 4th watch of the night, the Romans divided the night 6 to 9, 9 to midnight, midnight to 3, and 3 to 6. And the 4th watch of the night is somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. These guys have been in the water all night. Jesus has gone into the mountain to pray, and he decides, well, I'm going to join the guys on the other side. And he goes walking across the top of the water. His intention, because the storm doesn't bother him, he's just, walking on the water, is to pass these guys by. Well, as he's walking by them either in the early morning or with flashes of lightning going on because of this storm, they see a figure walking on the water. I don't know what your reaction is when you see something you don't expect to see. If you've ever been out and saw something you didn't expect to see, how it shocks you. If you've been in the woods and you saw a bear and you didn't think there were any bears there. Or if you've been someplace and thought you were by yourself in the house and, your spouse was there and it scared you to death. These guys are in this boat. They're struggling against this storm. And a man comes walking across the water. They see him and they are terrified because they think he's a spirit or a ghost or a water demon or something like that. Well, he hears them cry out and he turns his attention to them. Now, the Jews were very, very superstitious about water. They didn't like it. They weren't masterful sailors for sure. There was a time when they had a powerful navy because Solomon had boats that would go to Africa and bring back gold and ivory and animals and apes. But they typically weren't a seafaring people. And in fact, when Jesus says, if you offend one of these little ones, It'd be better for you to have a millstone tied around your neck and sunk in the depths. That was a terrifying thing to them, okay? And so they're in this water. They see him walking across the water. They are terrified. And he says to them, do not be afraid. Be of good cheer as I. Now, in Mark's account and in John's account, they invite him into the boat. In Matthew's account, this is where we get Peter walking on the water. Peter does this genius move. He goes, if it's really you, ask me to come to you walking on the sea. Now, just think about that as a strategy for some time. Let's suppose you're at your house at night, and you've got your Simply Safe attached, or you've got your alarm system, and somebody rattles the window and your alarm goes off, and you raise the window and you yell, get out of my yard. And the guy goes, oh, don't worry about me, I'm okay. And your strategy is, well, if you're really not a bad guy, ask me to come out into the yard with you. That's a special kind of dumb right there. Okay, but that's Peter's strategy in Matthew 14. He says, if you're really okay, ask me to get out of the boat and come to you. And we get that story of Peter walking on the water. They all end the same way. Jesus gets into the boat, and immediately the storm is calmed. And then you get this phrase, Mark chapter 6, verse 51. And he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down, and they were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. And their hearts were hard. When Mark tells this story about Jesus walking on the water, he ties it back in to the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. In fact, Mark will talk about this 2 different times. In fact, one of the times he does it, he's going to quote Jesus himself. If you go over to Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8, verse 14. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for 1 loaf they had with him in the boat. And Jesus said, be careful. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, it's because we have no bread. Now you get on the boat and you're a traveling group, and you're leaving Camp A and going to Camp B, and you get on the boat and you didn't bring any bread. You've got 1 loaf for 12 guys or maybe more. And Jesus gives them a warning when you're around the Pharisees and when you're around Herod, be careful of their influence, be careful of their leaven. Well, they hear this word, leaven, and they get real literal. They go, well, he's saying this because we forgot the bread. And so they're talking among themselves, and how dare you get us scolded because we didn't bring any bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see nor understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes that fail to see and ears that fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets of pieces did you pick up? They answered 7. And he said to them, do you still not understand? When John and Mark talk about this event, they tie the walking on the water and the stilling of the storm directly back to the bread. They panicked in this situation, and they fussed among themselves about this bread discussion, and Mark says, and it's because they didn't understand. I've got a friend named Aubrey Johnson. We talk a lot. If I write a book, I send him a draft and he reviews it, and he calls me and we talk about the ideas, and he sends this. He usually will write stuff out on a big whiteboard and take a picture of it and connect circles and draw lines, and then he'll go, now what am I missing? What are we missing? I remember as a kid reading the feeding of the 5,000. I remember reading Jesus walking on the water. Mark says the 2 things are connected. Their reaction and their fear and their amazement is because there's something about feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish they don't understand. What are we missing? What do we not understand about this story? Mark chapter 6, verse 30. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and all that they had taught. And then because so many people were coming and going that they did not have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." He's trying to do some insulation. And they went away by themselves into a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. And when Jesus landed, he saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. By this time it was late in the day. So his disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside villages and buy themselves something to eat." And Jesus said, "You give them something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat?" And they said to him, "That would take 8 months of a man's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" And Jesus asked, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, "We have 5 and 2 fish." Now, I've been told that 5 loaves and 2 fish would be equivalent to a can of sardines and a pack of saltine crackers. So that's what they've got. Now, math is not my strong suit. I'm not a very good mathematician. When I called my algebra teacher from Oxford High School, she had a doctorate from MIT. And she ended up marrying a guy from Piedmont, Alabama, and ended up teaching high school mathematics in Oxford, Alabama. And she's an MIT doctorate, and she had the Jones boys as math students. She had my brother, who was the valedictorian before me, and then when she had me, she asked, was I adopted? So that's just, the prowess of my math. I called her when I got my degree in psychology because I had passed behavioral and inferential statistics. And I called Dr. Long, and I said, "May I speak to Dr. Long?" She said, "This is Dr. Long." I said, "This is Lonnie Jones." She said, "The Lonnie Jones?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Then what correctional institution are we dialing from?" And I said, No, I'm not in prison, Dr. Long. I passed a math class. So math's not my strong suit. But if you've got 5,000 people, and you want to give everybody in the room a fish stick, how many fish sticks do you need? 5,000, right? If you've got 5,000 people in the room and you want to give everybody in the room 2 fish sticks, how many fish sticks do you need? Some of you NASA guys help me out. 10,000. Okay, if you got 5,000 people in the room, you're going to give everybody in the room 3 fish sticks. How many fish sticks do you need? 15,000 fish sticks. What do they have? 5 loaves, 2 fish sticks, a can of sardines, and a pack of saltine crackers. He says, "Well, bring it to me." Now, if you read some of the other occasions, it's a little boy who has 5 loaves and 2 fish. I don't know how you get a little boy's lunch away from him. Try to take chocolate from Gunnar Watkins. Okay, try to talk him out of his M&Ms. They get this kid's lunch. I think that's an Andrew skill. And they start handing out food. And they hand out food, and they hand out food, and they hand out food. And everybody eats until everybody is full. And then they take up 12 baskets of leftovers. Every apostle has a basket. Every apostle collects leftovers. They get into a boat. They go to the other side of the lake. They get caught in a storm. They can't negotiate this little body of water because of the storm. And somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., Jesus comes walking by, and he's less than concerned about what's going on. They see him. They scream out. They think he's a ghost. He says, "You guys don't be afraid. It's me. Be of good cheer." They bring him into the boat. The storm calms down. And Mark says it's because they didn't understand about the loaves. What do we miss about the loaves? Number one, we see not enough, and Jesus sees plenty. We see inadequate, and Jesus sees more than enough. We see a snack, he sees a feast. What they had not understood about the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000, what they had failed to remember was once you connect with Jesus, there's something you don't have to worry about anymore. And the one thing you don't have to worry about anymore is sufficiency. The one thing you don't have to worry about anymore is being inadequate. Jesus asked him, he said, don't you remember? How many baskets did you fill? He didn't even ask him how many did you feed. He said, how many baskets of leftovers did you pick back up? He tells them, when you're with me, you never, understand that? When you're with me, you never have to worry about bread anymore. Now, is bread a big worry or a little worry? On your scale of important things, is bread a big thing or a little thing? Hey, 90% of these people's diet were probably bread. He's telling them, when you come to think about the important needs of your life, when you are with me, you don't have to worry about your needs. Because where you see insufficient, I see sufficient. Where you see inadequate, I see adequacy. Where you see not enough, I see more than enough. And the second thing that they failed to understand is, if I can meet that need, if I can take 5 loaves and 2 fish and I can feed a multitude and take up 12 baskets of fragments, is there any way you can extrapolate that data and predict what might happen later on in your life? Everybody's talking about a new year. Well, when you run into a new year, you run into new problems. When you run into a new year, you run into new crisis. The human error is the assumption of permanence. The human body does not improve with age, and our condition changes. What will get us through all those transitions? What will get us through all those crises? What will get us through all those moments of tribulation in 2020? What got you through in 2019? What got you to 2019? Jesus said, if you understand how active I've been in your past, you can predict what can happen in your future, because what? Well, if we fail to remember the loaves, if we don't understand what Jesus did with what they had and what He could do with it, it's easy for us to get overwhelmed by anxiety. It's easy for us to get overwhelmed about being out of control. It's easy for us to find ourselves in a boat, in the middle, in the storm, and think we're going to perish. And just, don't you remember? Don't you remember that when there were 4,000 people and not enough food, you took up 7 baskets? Don't you remember when there were 5,000 people and not enough food, you took up 12 baskets? Here's the lesson we've got to learn, is that we can predict God's interaction and intervention in our lives based on what God has already done. Now, what miracle has God done in your life? Well, you're not eating fish sticks today. And God didn't say, bring 1 pizza to the fellowship hall. You know what God did for you? God took the insurmountable debt of sin and canceled it. He took something no human could work off. He took a problem no human could solve. He took a situation that none of us were adequate to deal with, and He handled it. That's a miracle. Because God took 5 loaves and 2 fish and called it a feast. And God took sinners and called them saints. And God took the weak and called us strong. And God took the inadequate and made us adequate. And God took the insufficient and made us more than sufficient. Paul writes in Philippians 4:19, he says, my God shall supply all your needs. And he's not just talking about physical needs. He's talking about spiritual needs. He's talking about psychological needs. He's talking about emotional needs. And if you want to make a prediction for 2020, the prediction you make for 2020 is, what has God done for me? And you can probably extrapolate what God can do. And the reason we get overwhelmed with problems, the reason we're in the middle of the boat, in the middle of the storm, and we see Jesus walking on the water, we scream and we cry, is because we're using insufficient data to predict outcomes. Because we think about what can I do in the boat rather than what can he do with me in the boat. And Peter's the only guy smart enough to understand I'm safer with him than I am in the boat, so I'll get out of the boat and go to him. Which I thought was crazy, but probably the only guy on the planet ever immediately liked Jesus. So when you think about the loaves and the fish, tie that into the story of stilling the storm and walking on the water. And what you get is that Mark points out the reason they had the reaction they had is because they forgot. They didn't remember. Their hearts were hard. They had not understood the loaves and the fish. And the loaves and the fish is not about food. The loaves and the fish is about supplying sufficiency. The loaves and the fish is about adequacy. The loaves and the fish says, if you will take what you think is inadequate, what you think is insufficient, what you think is not enough, and you just give it to God, what happens with what He does with it? Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20, to Him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we can ask or imagine. Now listen to those descriptors. To Him who can do exceedingly abundantly above. That's not just higher, but much higher and way higher. And it's above what we can ask or what we can imagine. Have you ever thought about how we would end the stories that we write if we wrote the endings of the stories in the Bible? Oh, here's these people that don't have enough food to eat. Well, Jesus finds a way to feed everybody and everybody gets a little. And nobody goes home mad. No, Jesus fills everybody up. And then there's 12 basketfuls left over. See, when we write our endings, we limit the power of God. When we think about what God can do with me, when we think about what God can do with my inadequacy or my insufficiency or my age or my health or my youth or whatever, we start thinking in terms and we measure them by human standards. We do human math. How many fish sticks you need? If you got 5,000, how many fish sticks did Jesus need? He took what they thought was he took a snack. Because 5 loaves and 2 fish, a can of sardines, and a pack of saltine crackers, not enough to fight over. Any grown man in this room, and several of you guys do way better than that, all right? Any grown man in this room eat that much. And Jesus takes what's a snack and turns it into a feast. And if you want to make a prediction for next year, just look at last year. Look at your baptism. Look at your salvation. Look at what God did with your sin problem. And then all of a sudden, I get the information. What am I missing? I'm missing that God has the ability to take what I think is not enough, and if I'll give up control, and if I'll let Him have it. See, God doesn't deal in the way we do math. God deals in potential. I heard somebody say that anybody can count the seeds in an apple, but God can tell you how many apples are in a seed. So you cut open an apple and go, there's 5 seeds there. God can take that seed and say, hey, you know what? There's this many apples potential in this seed. And God looks at our lives by what we can become, not by what we are. Romans chapter 4, verse 17, He gives life to the dead and calls things that are not as though they were. That's a verse that talks about a guy named Abraham who was 100 years old and didn't have any children, and God changed his name to Father of Many Nations. God takes a guy who has 0 children and calls him the Father of Many Nations at 100 years old. God looks beyond what we think we are. God looks at our Him, us. Care of your sin problem. We would do it, but that again is a faith issue. And faith is not believing in God. Faith is believing God. That whatever path He chooses, whatever steps He asks us to take, if we'll trust Him and do those things, if we give up our control, then He's written an ending that we couldn't imagine for ourselves. Years ago, I read a poem, and I'd like to kind of wrap up our lesson with that. Straight's what we talk about when you talk about take what I've got and give it to God and let God do with it what God can. Because if you give me control of the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, I have a snack. But if you give God the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, everybody eats, everybody's full, and you get 12 baskets of leftovers. The poem goes like this. It was battered and scarred, and the auctioneer scarcely thought it worth his while to waste his time on an old violin, but he held it up with a smile. What am I bid? Good folks, he said, who will start the bidding for me? $1, $2? No one would offer 3. It's going once, it's going twice, it's going and almost gone. But no, from the room far back came a gray-haired old man, and he walked forward, and he picked up the bow. And wiping the dust from the old violin and tightening the loosening strings, he played a melody, pure and sweet, like caroling angels sing. Then a voice that was now quiet and low, the auctioneer held up the old violin. But this time he held up the bow. Now, what am I bid, good folks, he said. Who'll start the bidding for me? 1,000, 2,000, then 3. The people cheered, going once, going twice, going and gone, cried he. The people cheered, and somebody said, hey, I don't understand. What changed the worth of the old violin? It's the touch of the master's hand. You take something you think is old and worn out and broken and insufficient and inadequate, and you give it to the master. And what he can do with its potential and its value is astronomically different than anything we can measure. And if you want to prepare for 2020, the triumphs and the tragedies, you take what it is that you are, that vessel, that old violin, and you say, you know what, I'm not going to be in charge of this. I'm going to let God have it. And if you remember the lesson of the loaves and the fishes, you'll understand that when the master is in control of your life, you don't have to worry about sufficiency and you don't have to worry about adequacy. You just have to worry about submission. And when we give control to the master, what he does with the value of our lives is different than what we do when we use human math on it and we try to keep score like that. If you're not a Christian, the master is not in control. If you are a Christian and you're not submissive, the master is not in control. Why don't you take those worries away? Why don't you remember the lesson of the loaves and the fishes? And if we can help you, come forward while we stand, while we sing.